You can really enhance or stylize your images in Photoshop using things like blending modes or opacity or different layer styles like the drop shadow effect. So let's take a closer look. Well, let's start by working with some different blending modes. And I'm going to go ahead and get this frame here. And actually, I'm going to change this a little bit. So why don't I go ahead and select everything and press delete. That just clears what was there. And I'm going to use my elliptical marquee and create a large circle in the middle to create a spotlight effect. Okay, looks good. Now, in order for this to really work, I want to make it a feather. So I'm going to go ahead and refine that edge and add a feather effect. Really soften it up as if it were going to be a spotlight with diffused light. And I'm going to invert that selection. And I'm going to go ahead and fill that, edit fill, with black. And it creates that spotlight effect. Go ahead and deselect it. Kind of a fun effect in there. But let's add a little oomph to that using blending mode. So right now the blending mode is normal, and we could change that to something like dissolve, and you can see how it adds an interesting effect if you were doing something like a volcano. Or we could try some other ones. I'm using my down arrow here just to cycle through because we already have, you can see there's a blue halo around there that's already active, and you can start seeing some of those different effects. What happens with blending modes is it's taking the pixels in the top layer and blending it with the pixels in the bottom layer. And depending on what the pixels are, you get different effects in here. Here's an overlay, which really is intensifying it. Now, keep in mind that the layers in the top pixel are black, and black and white are the two extremes. And so if your layers have black and white, you're going to get the most extreme. If your layers have other colors or other different gradations, you're going to get some different effects as well. Ooh, that's an interesting one with the hue and the saturation. Now I'm going to go and open this up, and you can see that the layers, or the effects rather, are actually grouped. And so where it says darken, all of these are going to give you some darker effects. So for example, multiply is often used with drop shadows, and all these things are going to give you some darker effects. Let's try that multiply. If you go over to the next group here, these are all associated with making things lighter. In fact, screen is often associated with an inner glow. Now keep in mind, because I have that black, some of these are the most absolute. These often will change the color. They'll do some mixing, and they can do everything from a real dramatic color shift to something very stylized. And then you get some other options, some very stylized options in here as well, and using hue. Okay, there you go. And that's kind of an interesting effect as well. Let's go ahead and hide that. Another thing that you can do is you can create a duplicate of an existing layer to really make some interesting effects. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate the beach. And when I apply some of the layer effects, for example, overlay, it really intensifies the color, simply because it's the same pixels, but they're blending in an interesting way. You could also do something like a multiply, or perhaps even a screen, and you can see how it's lightening or darkening it up. Or if we did something dramatic like difference or exclusion, you can see some interesting effects there. We could also do something with these horses as well and create an interesting effect with the horse. It's kind of fun. And we'll go ahead and put the horse in there with, how about exclusion, and you can see some interesting effects as well. There's a subtract. So using those blending modes can really add some contrast and some style, interesting effects to your documents. Let's go ahead and, whoops, it looks like I better put this one back on to normal, although I did have a neat option. We'll go ahead and turn that stylized on, and ooh, really stands out. Noticing how when you just change the stacking order of the layers, they really can make a difference of how things show up too. Okay, so the next thing we could do is we could add some opacity. And let's hide this for just a second so you can see what's going on with the opacity here. And this is referring to the shadow. There's a shadow area for the horses. And one of the things that we could do is we could change the opacity. And I can click on that drop down and move those up or down. It was originally something about 40 something. I could also go over here on the word opacity and just drag it. This has a scrubber. So I can just drag it left and right. And you can see how it's adding lightness. And as you change the opacity, you can actually see the pixels that are coming through. Probably more dramatic as we start changing the opacity on the horses themselves. And if slide that down, you can start seeing the pixels through. And it's not quite the same as completely invisible, but it's creating sort of a translucent or transparent effect. Okay. Now let's explore some of the actual layer effects or layer styles that we have. The text itself and these frames, they actually have some effects on them. And you can even hide those effects. There's eyeballs there to see them. You can also collapse. Here's the option. You can collapse them if you want to love more real estate in your panel. If you double click on the FX, it opens up your styles. And they used to be called layer effects back in the day, but now they're called layer styles. And you can see that there's lots of different options that you can use. So for example, if I go to drop shadow, now I can simply click on the option and it's going to add a drop shadow. You can see it here when I uncheck it. It's because the preview's turned on. But if I actually click on the word drop shadow, it changes the settings so that I can see what the features are. I can even customize it to my own nature. You can see the default blending mode for the drop shadow is multiply, and you could change that if you wanted to. You could change the color. For example, if you want to do something like a red drop shadow, you could do that, and maybe with an overlay adds a different effect in there. I'm going to use my Alt key and just click on reset, and it resets all of those settings back to the default. Come back here to drop shadow and check it. I could also change things like the global lighting. So this controls what direction those shadows and those different effects are coming from. And the fact that we're using a global light means that any effects that might have some angle will all be using the same angle for that particular layer. For example, if we go to outer glow, or let's try, maybe not outer glow, let's try an inner shadow. And you can see the inner shadow also has an angle, and it's using that global light. And you can do things like adding a stroke or adding a bevel emboss feature, really makes it pop out more. So just different elements that you can use. Click on OK. Now there's also, as you're working with this, if you like the effect in here, you can actually copy and paste it. Now when you right click, it all depends on where you right click, but you can copy the layer style. So I was right clicking on the FX or the symbol here, and then I can paste the layer style onto another element. Or I could take this one, expand it out. I could say, no, I think I like this one better, and I could copy the layer style and paste that layer style as well. So you can choose whichever layer styles you like, and you can also show and hide different styles as you see fit. Now, an interesting thing about the fill versus the opacity. The opacity is going to hide everything. So if I have, let's make sure I have the right layer active. If I have my text layer, my type layer here, and I start changing the opacity and moving it down, you can see how everything in here is getting a little bit softer and more transparent. But the fill is different. The fill affects the pixels, but not in the layer style. So notice there's a drop shadow, and as I change the opacity down, you can still see that drop shadow with a lot of intensity. In fact, if I bring in my gradients and my bevel, you can still see those even though I'm changing the fill. And if I go back to my opacity and I start pulling the opacity down, notice that it's even dimming all the elements, not just the pixels. So that's the real difference, is the fill it does not affect the layer styles. Well, another little tip and trick about layer styles is there's actually a panel called layer styles. I'll go ahead and pull this right back. And so in addition to creating your own, you can take advantage of these many default options. And you just click, and as you're clicking on it, you're seeing some changes right away, but also the different effects are coming to place. I'm going to go ahead and go to that flyout. We're looking at a particular set of panels, but there's actually more. Here's one called text effects. And the difference between OK, cancel, append. Cancel, of course, means I didn't mean to do that. OK is going to switch out the effects. So let's go ahead and try that. And so I have a different set of styles in here. Those are interesting ones. There's that green one. But if I go back down to text effects, OK is going to replace it. Append is going to add to it. So if I click on append, it doesn't remove those existing styles. It just adds to it, and I can have some other styles available. Definitely some interesting effects. And these are all different combinations, but it's a great way to reverse engineer some interesting styles. And then you can always come back in and double click on any one of these elements. For example, here is my gradient overlay. I could double click on it and make some changes based on whatever I wanted to do with a starter here. I'll go back in and I'm going to reset the styles. I'll click on OK, and then it resets it back to the defaults. So using your blending modes and your opacity or the fill or the different layer styles, you can actually customize that any way you want. Okay, now it's time for a pop quiz. What blending mode is used to create a drop shadow effect? A, multiply, B, screen, C, overlay, D, hue. The answer is A, multiply. Well, now it's your turn to go in there and start creating your own images and start using blending modes and opacities and different layer effects.